Seats, please. Thank you. This next session is called, as you can read, the Larger Picture, and chairing it is Pat Brennan, recently retired. Are you emeritus yet? I certainly hope so. Good. Professor Emeritus of the Department of History and our resident, or was resident, First World War expert. And he will be chairing this next panel. So Pat, take it away.
Thank you, David. It's always nice to be introduced as an expert. It's a very high-octane panel. I'm quite honored just to be the chair of it, and I'm very much looking forward, as you are, to the three presenters. We'll go in the order that are listed in the program. So first up will be Dr. Jack Granatstein, who you can read all about him. But I would add, that's not in his material here, but he was my PhD supervisor, so my mentor, Jack.
I refuse to accept the blame for Patrick. Unfortunately, I'll repeat some of Rob Rotherdale's material. He too was one of my PhD students, and it's awful when your former students usurp your subject. But let me begin with a brief summary of Vimy. The Canadian assault on Vimy Ridge was planned by a former real estate agent from Victoria, BC, General Arthur Currie, and a physicist from McGill University in Montreal, Colonel Andy McNaughton. They had a British commander, like all the Dominions, but this commander, Julian Byng, had the good sense to let the Canadians run their own show. Instead of sticking to the old British approach of frontal attacks on the enemy, the Canadians under Currie decided to analyze the situation first. They used trigonometry to figure out exactly where the enemy fire was coming from. And they used a new instrument, the oscilloscope, to measure the muzzle velocity of their heavy guns. With this information, they could set all the sights of their guns to fire volleys that would land in a straight, accurate line on the German trenches. Canadian troops could advance more quickly behind this barrage because the line of danger from falling explosive projectiles was narrow and predictable. I'm surprised that none of you laughed at that utter nonsense. It's not me quoting myself. This is from Canada, A Country by Consent, a website aimed at high school students, now in its 5th edition and approved by a number of provinces and territories as a resource for history courses. There's scarcely a statement in that account full of alternative facts and myths that is correct. But these paragraphs make clear that Vimy mattered. It matters for present-day Canadian nationalists, for those who dislike the British way of running wars, and for those convinced that Canadians, even if, and especially because they weren't professional soldiers, could do better on the battlefield than those trained to fight. These tropes can be found in almost every textbook, and certainly they have been evident in the recent media coverage of the 100th anniversary of Vimy. We here know what we might call the true facts. The attack plan was shaped by Byng's staff. The key figures were Percy Radcliffe, the Brigadier General Staff, who had 4 capable British Army General Staff officers, grade 2, working for him, by the Deputy Adjutant and Quartermaster General, Brigadier General C.J. Farmer, British officer, the General Officer Commanding Heavy Artillery, Brigadier General C.B. Massey, another British officer, and the Staff Officer Royal Artillery, Major Alan Brooke, later a Field Marshal, Chief of the Imperial General Staff in World War II. All were British Army officers. Arthur Currie was, of course, central to the planning of his 1st Division's attack on April 6th. He was one of many British Expeditionary Force officers who had been sent by the BEF to study French tactics and innovations at Verdun. Brooke, Major Alan Brooke, also was one of that group. But even in planning the 1st Division attack, as in the other 3 Canadian divisions, Currie's key staff officers were still British, though Ottawa and the Canadian staff in London had begun to call for Canadianization. In the 1st Division, the GSO-1 and the GSO-2 were British officers, as was one of Currie's brigade commanders. The 3rd Canadian Division, in fact, was commanded by a British Army officer, Major General Louis Lipset. In all, as Professor Doug Delaney has noted, 41 British officers were attached to the 4 divisions of the Canadian Corps in April 1917 and held all the key planning posts. Byng's plan at Vimy had been in creation since November 1916. His logistics planners tackled the task of getting huge quantities of shells to the guns, along with the food, ammunition, and supplies of all kind. Roads had to be constructed, improved, and maintained. Trucks had to be driven by good drivers and kept running. 50,000 horses had to be fed, watered, and led by soldiers to carry supplies and guns forward. A water pipeline capable of delivering 600,000 gallons a day had to be built. 20 kilometers of tramways, essentially a light rail system, had to be built and maintained to move supplies forward and casualties backwards. Tunnelers bored into the soft chalk of the ridge and created tunnels or subways well below the surface in which the troops could shelter. Other tunnels held huge mines to be exploded at the time of the attack. The infantry intensively practiced their part in the attack behind the lines. The Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, for example, trained for 5 weeks for the Vimy attack. Platoon tactics had evolved from the mass groups that had fought on the Somme in 1916. The platoon was now a combination of riflemen, Lewis gunners, grenadiers, and section commanders, augmented as necessary with moppers up attached from supporting battalions, snipers, stretcher bearers, scouts, and possibly a Vickers machine gun. The platoon commander now led a group of specialists and directed their tactics as required. In addition, as we've heard, 40,000 topographical maps, carefully marked, were handed out to every section of infantry, showing what lay to their front, and air photos were also available in quantity. Plasticine models with every machine gun and dugout carefully marked were studied, and as aerial patrols brought in new information, the soldiers were kept up to date. Every man had to know his role. Surprisingly, perhaps, this training worked. One Lewis gunner in the 2nd CMR in the 3rd Division said later that when we finally reached the top of the hill, we not only landed in exactly the right place, but we knew we were in the right section of those trenches we were supposed to be in. The planning, training, and logistical preparations Byng and his staff had mandated was unprecedented in the BEF. In other words, and contrary to the entirely typical account I quoted that was aimed at high school students, the Canadians did not run their own show at Vimy. They were part of the BEF that was engaged in a large assault on the Arras front, and they were led by a British commander whose plan for the assault on the ridge was made by his largely British staff. Moreover, 7 of the 9 heavy artillery groups employed on the Vimy front were British, and most of the ammunition and food, equipment, and supplies of all types that the Canadians used came from Britain's vast production. And again, the artillery plan for the Corps, for the creeping barrage, was made by the Staff Officer Royal Artillery at Byng's headquarters, the future Field Marshal. If the Canadian Corps heavily depended on the British Army and its supply chain, It also must be said that the infantry battalions and every unit in the Corps, with one exception, depended on British-born soldiers. At the time of Vimy, almost 6 in 10 of the soldiers in the Corps were relatively recent British immigrants to Canada. There were also substantial numbers of Americans and other foreign-born men who had joined the Army in Canada. What stands out was that there were only 44% of the men in the CEF who had been born in Canada. A sessional paper presented to Parliament in June 1917 provided data for the period to April 30th, 1917. It reported that 125,000, I'm rounding the numbers, Canadian-born, English-speaking Canadians were in Britain and France, alongside 155,000 British subjects born outside of Canada, almost all of whom came from the British Isles. That paper also noted that the Canadian-born figure included 14,100 French Canadians serving overseas, a number that encompassed almost 6,000 recruited from outside Quebec. These specific numbers may be incorrect, and probably are, but the broad strokes were certainly right. And it was not until just before the armistice and after conscription had added 100,000 men to the Army that the Canadian-born may have constituted a bare majority of the CEF ranks. I think actually the numbers show, when studied closely, that there never was a Canadian-born majority. There were French Canadians scattered among countless other units of the Canadian Corps, but the Francophone infantry component in France consisted of only one battalion, the Royal 22nd. Almost all of its soldiers were Canadian-born. Prime Minister Sir Robert Borden was in England for meetings of the Imperial War Cabinet when the attack went in, and he had visited the troops in France and gone around the hospitals in France and England after Vimy. He was elated at the successful attack, as were the Canadian media, as we've heard, but horrified by the 10,600 casualties. Borden knew that recruiting in Canada was slowing and literally almost dried up. So too did the British. In London, they had pressed Borden hard to have his country do more in the war. Thus, when Borden returned to Canada in May, he did so determined to raise more men by enforcing conscription for overseas service, a decision that he knew and accepted would split the country on linguistic and class and rural-urban lines. Here, Vimy mattered very much. But did Vimy matter militarily? We know that the war was not won by the Canadians at Easter 1917. There was no breakthrough, no cavalry regiments spreading out through the gap in the German lines to wreak havoc in the enemy rear. The ridge at Vimy offered a splendid view to the east toward the mining town of Lens, and the Bavarian and Prussian troops were forced to pull back on the Douai plain. But for the Germans, Vimy was at worst a draw, especially as no breakthrough had occurred. It did confirm in the minds of the German general staff that their strategy of elastic defense was the better course to follow, and they did in fact do that. The war on the Western Front went on. For the men of the Canadian Corps, however, Vimy really did matter. As Tim Cook put it, Vimy would be the turning point in the war for the Canadian Corps, the point where it moved from an amateur to a professional war-fighting force. It was a major success in the generally sluggish BEF assault on the Arras front, and it made the Canadians believe that they were first-rate soldiers, the finest troops on earth, one soldier said. They had done what the French had failed to do in 1914 and 1950. They had led the British attack that April, and almost alone in the BEF advance, they had taken all their objectives in a perfectly executed set-piece attack. General Byng wrote to his wife, "Poor old Prussian Guard, what a mouthful to swallow, being beaten to hell by what they called untrained colonial levies. The Canadians' morale was sky high after Vimy, and it largely remained so through the grueling battles to come. A homogeneous formation that stayed together and fought together most of the time, the Canadian Corps had become a corps d'élite, the shock army of the British Empire, in Shane Schreiber's apt phrase. Arthur Currie noted correctly in a post-war letter that whenever the British First Army were asked to do anything, they invariably called upon the Canadians, and we were asked to do the job. Currie's appointment to command the Corps and the victory at Vimy had given the Canadians more autonomy on the battlefield. They were and remained a part of the BEF, but Currie, the government at home, and the nation's representatives in Britain pushed for more room to act as a more autonomous part of the empire. Currie could and did argue that his way of operating worked. He could and did press to get more engineers, trucks, and guns for the Corps, and he could and did argue the necessity of keeping the 4 Canadian divisions together. Vimy mattered because it strengthened the Canadian hand. Still, there was one man who was less than pleased with Vimy's renown, Arthur Currie. He understood as much as anyone how much Vimy mattered, but as he wrote in 1922, if they place the large memorial at Vimy, it will confirm for all time the impression which exists in the mind of the majority of the people of Canada that Vimy was the greatest battle fought by the Canadians in France. In my mind, Currie went on, that is very far from being a fact. We fought other battles where the morale and material results were greater and more far-reaching than Vimy. There were other victories also that reflected to a greater degree the training and efficiency of the Corps. Vimy, Currie continued, was a set piece for which we had trained and rehearsed for weeks. It did not call for the same degree of resource and initiative that were displayed in any of the 3 great battles of the last 100 days, Amiens, Arras, and Cambrai. Currie had led the Corps in those battles, and he might have been thinking that the victorious achievements won under his command, achievements that clearly played a much more substantial role in winning the war, mattered as much or more than those when it was led by Byng. But as early as 1922, Currie was surely right in assessing the impact the Vimy Memorial would have on the Canadian public's memory of the Great War. The attention given to the centenary this month is proof of that. So too is the Canadian government's complete lack of planning for any commemoration of the 100 days next year. Currie may have believed that those were the most important of his Corps' battles, but neither the ahistorical Canadian public nor Canada's present-day government does. As so often happens, mythology has trumped fact. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Granatstein. Our second speaker will be Dr. Tim Cook.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Pat. Thanks to everyone here at Calgary who have organized this, David Berkison, and especially Nancy and the staff and the students. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I especially have enjoyed listening to the other papers. I think the German perspective is a welcome one, and the various facets of the battle and also of the memory. The 100th anniversary of Vimy Ridge, on the 9th of April 2017, was a major event. It was my pleasure to be there. I was with CBC reporting upon it. I don't think it was quite, as Professor Rotherdale says, a homage to the birth of a nation. It was far more complex than that. It was an interesting event, a commemorative event to watch, to be a part of, to see 25,000 Canadians go to the ridge, 12,000 of them young people. 12,000 of them 14, 15, 16, 17 years old, many of them in tears while they were there. It seemed to me watching to be a profoundly moving event for almost everyone who was there. There was also an element, I think, of celebration there, which doesn't always sit easily with commemorative aspects. I could have done without the dancing, and I could have done without some of the singing involved in the Vimy commemorations, but that too is a part of an event that encompasses the idea of loss and grief and bereavement, but also a symbol of nation building and coming together. And at Vimy, where we often return on anniversaries, as Dr. Derflinger rightly pointed out, we think about Vimy and we reconceptualize Vimy and we add new meaning to Vimy. And I think it is important for us to think about the idea of Vimy over 100 years. And that is what my new book looks at. And there's other books as well, other ideas out there. There is the McKay book and Swift called The Vimy Trap. It's a odious, mean-spirited little book. Reads, I think, like a second-year polemic from a undergrad who is suffering from post-traumatic Harper disorder. But that's okay, I can say that because he's saying those things about me as well, being a warmongering, nationalistic chest thumper. And that's fine, because I think there is a fierce debate and discussion about what Vimy means. And I would suggest to you, as I normally do on books like this, you might want to read his book to get a different perspective, but I really don't think you should. And don't buy it. So there we go. Thanks, Jack. But Vimy is contested. The idea of Vimy is contested. And in thinking about and trying to talk about Vimy for 20 minutes, I thought I perhaps would talk about that phrase, the birth of the nation. And of course, it's a famous one that is associated with Vimy over time. The famous quote by Alexander Ross, a wartime brigadier who was a battalion commander at Vimy, later head of the Canadian Legion. He said, "It was Canada from the Atlantic to the Pacific on parade. I thought then that in those few minutes I witnessed the birth of a nation." Now that quote is repeated over and over again in the media and textbooks, on the Canadian War Museum website. What's interesting about that, I think, is that it's not well contextualized. He said that in 1967, not in 1917, the date of the battle. Now, he was at the battle. He may have thought that on the day of the battle, but it took 50 years for him to articulate that. And I think that's important, to think about that quote and the contextualization of that quote and the idea of Vimy and that phrase. And so this talk briefly, I want to explore the birth of that notion. I think it's important to return to the battle, and Professor Rutherford and Professor Granatstein have done a fine job, I think, in talking about the battle and the complexities of the battle and what happened there, and perhaps to dig down and to explore some of those constructed meanings that immediately come out of the battle. The thing that I was looking for was the phrase, the birth of a nation, used by soldiers on the 9th to the 12th of April. As you know, in my many books, it's been my pleasure to read thousands of letters and diaries from soldiers. They are among the most powerful documents that I have read. They speak to me. They are the stuff of history. So what did Canadian soldiers say? And you won't be surprised, I think, to find that nobody said on the 9th of April or the 12th of April or in between there that Vimy was the birth of the nation. Now that isn't to say that Vimy didn't matter to Canadians. There are a tremendous number of letters and diary entries where Canadians are talking about the importance of this battle. For many of the things that Jack or others have said here, that we succeeded when the French failed, that we took the ridge that was nearly an impregnable position, that we planned for this thing and we carried off an operation. Weighing, of course, the rough history from 1915 and 1916, where there are not a lot of Canadian victories or Allied victories to that point. All of these things come together. One officer, Lieutenant Edward Saywell from Millgrove, Ontario, wrote in his diary on the first day of Vimy, "Canadian soldiers this day did more to give Canada a real standing among nations of the world than any previous single act in Canadian history." Now that's an important and powerful statement, and there are others like it by Canadians. They knew they had done something important. It, of course, had been a terrible, bloody conflict. The 4-day battle cost 10,602 casualties, as I talk about in my book. There are thousands of other Vimy casualties that should be ascribed to the battle, the 3 months leading up to the battle. There are hundreds of soldiers who die of their wounds after the 12th of April. They too should be counted as part of the battle. But even just that figure of 10,602 casualties, think today we're a country 5 times as large. That would be 52,000 casualties today in a 4-day battle. That gives you a sense of the loss that we are talking about here. In fact, the first day of the battle, and in a little bit into the second, there are 7,700 Canadian casualties. The first day of Vimy is the single bloodiest day in Canadian military history. It's worse than Dieppe. It's worse than all the other battles. And it's worth reflecting upon. How do you take your most costly day and turn it into something that is about the birth of a nation? How do you take a place of death and turn it into a place of life for a country? Vimy was important from the start, but I think, as Jack nicely put there, it's important for a number of tactical reasons. It's important to the Canadian Corps. It's important to the professionalization of the Corps. There are other battles that we fight that are important. In the summer of 1917, Serge Derflinger's new book on Hill 70 gives a nice sense of the importance of that battle. The titanic struggle at Passchendaele in October, November of 1917. The defense of Vimy Ridge again in March and April of 1918. And of course, Jack's recountings of the 100 Days, the Battle of Amiens, in fact, a series of 5 or 6 battles, depending on how you count them. The Canadians fought in all of these, often used as a spearhead formation, always delivering victory. The war itself also had a tremendous effect on the home front. Pat Brennan did a fabulous job yesterday in talking about how we came together like never before during this war. The patriotic movements, the coming together and being galvanized by the war effort, but at the same time nearly being torn apart by the strain of this war, something that we don't see at Vimy, something that we don't celebrate and mark, and how the country was nearly torn apart by the Great War. And all of that is to suggest, I think, that the First World War was something quite unlike anything we had been to up to that point. Historians talk about and debate what the meaning is, from social and cultural history to linguistic or regional history and operational studies. Whatever you want to say is fine, but there is no denying that the First World War changes us forever as a people. A new nation emerged from war's wreckage. There was no going back. And I think the dead, the wartime dead, 66,000 Canadian dead, have a tremendous influence on how we remember the war, especially in that first decade. As Mike Neiberg mentioned yesterday, on the memory in the United States, it follows a similar trajectory, I think. That first decade, how would the war be framed? How would we make sense of this war that kills so many Canadians? We see it increasingly, immediately, as our step forward, that our step onto the world stage. We have the various signings at the Treaty of Versailles, League of Nations, things like that. But still, it's how we will make sense of those dead that I think is so important. And Canadians come together and they say that this is a war that mattered. This was a war, in their words, that was a fight for civilization. This was a just sacrifice. This is a war that had to be fought. That is the dominant voice in the 1920s. And we mark this war in multiple ways, and Jonathan Vance's scholarship is important for having set us off in this direction from the late 1990s, thinking about how the war is marked, how it is commemorated, often in plain sight, still there today in churches, in schools, in businesses, in street names. And Pat Brennan took me out to see a mountain range two days ago, of which it's named after warships and generals and Italian generals of all things. It is here, it is around us. And those local monuments are among the most powerful, built across this country, in every community, every city, every town, almost 5,000 in Canada, to mark the sacrifice of this generation. And what you choose to mark, what you choose to commemorate, is important. The First World War, we decided to mark that. That mattered to us as a people. And I just want you to think about one example here. I don't know if Mark Humphreys is still here. Mark's fabulous book on the Spanish flu. 50,000 Canadians who die from the flu, late 1918, early 1919. Where are the 5,000 monuments to them? Almost the same number as killed during the First World War on the battlefield, but almost nothing. We, as a Canadian people, decided that was not an event that we were going to mark. Why is that? Well, the war meant something to us in a very different way. We created national monuments. Parliament buildings burned down, built the Peace Tower, books of remembrance that are there. The National Monument in Ottawa, unveiled, ironically, in May of 1939, only months before we go to war again. This time, we decided to go to war on the 10th of September. And of course, there were the overseas monuments. We decided, Currie leading the way, that we would mark 8 battlefields overseas. There's an interesting discussion about this, how we would mark them. I talk about it in the book. There's a national competition, there's a short list, and the eventual winner is Walter Allward, the Toronto sculptor. And he's an interesting character in himself. The building of the monument is a fascinating one. We all know it. We can see it in our mind's eye. What is fascinating about his initial contract, signed in early 1922, is that it doesn't say he's going to build his monument at Vimy Ridge. He is supposed to go to Belgium and build the monument at Hill 62. That's fascinating. If you don't know the Battle of Mont-Sorel, you're not alone. June 1916, really the Canadians lose the first 2 rounds and counterattack and have a draw by the end of it. It's an odd place to want to put Canada's national monument. And what you have to conclude from that is that Vimy is not yet the birth of the nation if it's not where we're going to build our monument overseas. The building of the monument itself is a fascinating story, the saga of the stone. Walter Allward traveling across Europe looking for the stone, that powerful, almost luminescent limestone that he uses, his 20 sculptured figures, the names of the fallen Canadians in France with no known graves, 11,285. This is, and the building of the monument is itself a part of the Vimy legend. But the point I want to make to you, and the important one I think about the Vimy Monument, is that is to all of our dead. And what we see with the building of the monument on Vimy Ridge, and it is moved there in early 22, I jumped over that, my apologies, an intervention by a surprising Canadian, William Lyon Mackenzie King. You all know Mackenzie King, of course, that long service political survivor, better known to most Canadians as the guy who talked to his dead dog and his dead mum and all of that. But he intervenes to put it at Vimy for a number of interesting reasons. But the monument itself is to all Canadians. And I think when you build the monument on Vimy Ridge, we begin to see a conflating of 2 ideas. The idea of Vimy and what it matters for all the reasons that we've talked about, and the monument itself, which stands for the entire war and the sacrifice in the war and the importance of this war. And they begin to come together. And they're not together in the 1920s. It's a key event. It is the Vimy pilgrimage that brings them together. 6,200 Canadians and their veterans and their family members move from Canada. Another 1,500 or so come from Britain. They arrive on Vimy Ridge. They cross the Atlantic on 5 ocean liners. They see themselves as pilgrims on a religious voyage back to the ridge. But the key event there is King Edward VIII, who unveils the monument. Our king unveils it. And the royal presence is a fascinating one to think about from 1936, or as Serge showed us from 1967, or in 2007, with the Queen there adding a significant meaning to that, or more recently last week with Prince Charles. But it is the pilgrimage that plays a key event, I think, in propelling the Vimy idea forward. And I wondered, was it there where we hear the phrase, the birth of a nation? And it's not. There is much speechifying there. There is a talk of the fallen and the dead, the importance of Vimy. In fact, Ernest Lapointe, the Minister of Justice, reads Mackenzie King's words there, and he says this. It's in sort of typical Mackenzie King wording, which means backwards and doesn't actually say what it means to say, but it is nonetheless that at Vimy, their hour of testing, the souls of the Canadians revealed themselves gloriously at the summit of their national ascendancy. Now, that's not the birth of the nation, but it's something similar. The true Canadian nation, a new nation, has emerged on the ridge, the true soul revealed there. But I think you can only say that because it is the monument that is there on the ridge. It is not the battle, but the two of them become conflated. The battle represents the sacrifice. The monument marks that sacrifice, not just of Canadians, but of the entire nation. And the story of Vimy from 36 onwards is fascinating. Being overrun during the Second World War by the German forces, its liberation in 1944, and the hardest part of my book to write was the history of the Vimy idea from 1945 onwards. Because what did it mean? How do you document and write about the history of an idea? There are not a lot of books like that. And so I used various sources to look at it, and I had to conclude that Vimy from 1945 to the mid-1960s really didn't mean a lot to Canadians. The monument was little visited. In fact, there's interesting reports of the National Archives of the caretakers there who are complaining, saying, where are the Canadians? Why are no Canadians coming here? They spend all their time chasing away French couples who are making out on the monument. And we, of course, changed as a country after the Second World War. We, of course, changed as a people. The Second World War is absolutely fundamental to understanding how Canada's arc of nationhood continues to rise and change and to become more North American. And we lose and turn our backs largely on the memory of the two world wars. And we embrace the idea of peacekeeping, and we embrace the idea that we are the peaceable kingdom. And it looks like Vimy will disappear as an idea. It will be a one-generation idea for us as Canadians. It doesn't speak to us in the early 60s. And then, surprisingly, the Great War comes back again. 1964 to 68, the 50th anniversary. These anniversaries matter. They focus the media. They impel historians and writers to write about these things. There are a whole number of books and plays and novels that come out around the world about the First World War, most of them negative, most of them talking about, in the British sense, the squandered generals who squander the lives of their soldiers. But in Canada, the message is different. In Canada, it is how the First World War has forever changed the country. And in thinking about them, there's a whole bunch of books that come out in the 1960s. Just as a general aside, I find it fascinating that we have almost no history books that have come out this year, in 2017, that try to talk about the country. There are dozens of them that come out in the 1960s, and almost all of them point to the First World War as that key event that changed us. And if it's one single event, it is Vimy. And Serge did a wonderful job in talking about the controversy of 67, but as part of that controversy, Lester B. Pearson, Great War veteran, part of a key figure who is changing Canada at this point, bringing in stronger bilingualism, bringing in new signs and symbols, the Canadian flag. But under Pearson, he goes back to Vimy as an important symbol, and he says this: it was the birth of a nation. And it is appropriate that as we celebrate the centennial anniversary of the creation of our country, we should recognize the one event above all others that made it a nation half a century later. And there it is. Brigadier Ross saying it in the same year, Prime Minister Pearson saying it that year, other veterans saying it that year. 50 years after the battle, but 100 years after the birth of the country. And you have to understand how this nationalistic impulse is coming together to infuse the Vimy idea. And I'm running out of time here, so I think I will finish up, but say that, of course, the birth of a nation is a complex idea. But you have to conclude, I think, that if you talk about Vimy of being the birth of the nation, what we are talking about is the emergence of a new country coming out of the First World War, and that it is the war itself that has changed us. And I find it interesting that it is in 50-year blocks, if we are to think about Canada emerging. In those first 50 years, we had developed as a country, we had developed a series of national systems, were emerging as our own country, but it's the First World War that changes us so dramatically. And 100 years on in 1967, in looking back on the last 50 years, it is the war and Vimy that we use to tell the story about ourselves. And I think, interestingly, 10 days ago, at 150 years almost, looking back on the last 50 years and how Canada has changed so dramatically over those 50 years. We are a very different country today than we were even 50 years ago and where we were 50 years before that. I did not expect to hear the phrase, the birth of a nation. And lo and behold, our Prime Minister, while speaking in French, said Vimy was the birth of a nation. It is a powerful symbol and message that endures over time. Vimy continues to matter 100 years on because the idea of Vimy is much more than just a battle. Vimy has been embraced by Canadians over several generations as a symbol of martial might, of unity of purpose, of terrible sacrifice, and of the nation coming together to do something hard. That, almost by definition, is how we describe a nation-building event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cook, for a fine talk delivered with the passion which we've come to expect but never take for granted. Our final speaker today of the three is Dr. Mike Neiberg. Mike?
Thank you very much. I was thinking as I was sitting listening to Tim that birth of a nation in the American context means something so different. It refers to the Ku Klux Klan promoting movie, so to hear the phrase being used positively is a little bit strange. Peaceable Kingdom, too, has a different meaning in the American context. Anyway, everybody's been starting out by thanking the organizers here. I did that last night. I should do it again, but this time I'm not, because there is an old expression in Hollywood that you should never follow a child or an animal act. Last night, I had to follow the Highlanders, and today I have to follow Jack and Tim, which is not an easy thing to do. But it is a great honor to be on a stage with two scholars whose work I've read and admired and do presentations in the same panel. So this is a great honor. I confess I had some initial difficulty getting my thoughts together for this talk on the larger picture of 1917. I was at the time working in a museum exhibit in Philadelphia on 1917, which had based the exhibit around the three main events of that year: the Russian revolutions, plural, the entry of the United States into World War I, and the Balfour Declaration, which changed, of course, the modern Middle East. I thought about borrowing from that method to do this paper, but then I figured that there was really not much need for you to fly me all the way from Pennsylvania to tell you that the Russians had two important revolutions, the United States entered the First World War, you heard me blather on about that yesterday, and that the British made muddled promises to mutually antagonistic groups in the Middle East. Nor do you need an American to come to talk to you about 1917's arguably most important Canadian event, Vimy Ridge, when people like Jack and Tim can do it so much better than I can. So, I'm going to start by assuming that the people in this room know the broad outlines of the timeline that I just gave you, and if you don't, you can see David, who will take away your right to have lunch after this panel today. In all seriousness, it ought to go without saying that precisely because I do not need to go into those events individually, we cannot forget that they are incredibly important to the history of the war and indeed the history of the world in 1917. Any one of those events I listed would be worthy of a separate conference. Indeed, I think one could make a pretty solid argument that American entry into the war, those two Russian revolutions, and British meddling in the Middle East could by themselves qualify for a list of the most important events of the 20th century. How much different would today's world look without any one of them? Still, I'm going to try to do something a little bit different here today, and I'm going to walk out on a little bit of a tightrope. Rather than recap these events, I'm going to try to put a little bit of meaning and military context into them, especially as they relate to the conduct of war in 1917. First, it seems to me that we need to place 1917 into some historical context, an exercise that might seem odd for an historian to do. Placing events in time is, of course, what we're trained to do, and a few salient points seem to me worth noting. We now know, for example, that 1917 was designed to be the penultimate year of the war, at least as it is conventionally periodized in the West. But contemporaries, of course, did not know that. They were planning for a war lasting into 1918, 1919, or as the Americans were already doing, into 1920. Indeed, 1917 had begun on a pessimistic note. Woodrow Wilson, recently re-elected to the White House in November of 1916, had asked the great powers to state their war aims, and notably, they could not do so in a way that left Woodrow Wilson any optimism that he could begin negotiations. The conclusion that he and the American leadership reached was that the belligerents were not fighting for limited goals that could be negotiated, as they had in years past, but for a total victory that would only come when one side completely overwhelmed the other. In such an environment, there was little that Woodrow Wilson, the international socialist movement that had met in Sweden in 1916, could do. War in early 1917 seemed to have become the permanent condition of Europe. Economic and military planners in the halls of power in London, Paris, Berlin, Ottawa, and elsewhere were therefore planning for a war that would not end until one side had thoroughly destroyed the other. In early 1917, people spoke of another 7 years' war, another 30 years' war, or even in the most apocalyptic imaginings, another 100 years' war. Propagandists on all sides began to steel their peoples for a long conflict, and critics grew increasingly despondent over a permanent war that seemed increasingly disconnected from any logical gain or outcome. My personal favorite example of this is a postcard in the collection of the Historia de la Grande Guerre in Péronne. It features an angry French baby emerging from an egg with a bayoneted rifle in his hands and asking the question, "Y a-t-il encore des Boches?" Are there still any Germans around? I also saw a 1917 cartoon in Philadelphia recently showing two soldiers asked if the babies born in 1917 should just be called the conscription class of 1935 in order to save time later on. Now, it would take a few decades to reveal the prescience of these descriptions of generational war, but the central point remained. No end to the war seemed in sight in early 1917. On this note, it is worth keeping in mind the awful fact that periodizations of wars lasting years or even decades existed for contemporary Europeans not in the realm of science fiction, but of course in their own history, by which I mean they had seen or had known about 100 years' wars and 30 years' wars. Now, the experiences of the years 1914 to 1916 had showed the great fallacy of the arguments of men like the banker Ivan Bloch and the writer Norman Angell, who had presumed that modern states could not suffer the costs of total war for a period of years. Economies, they argue, would break, populations would demand peace, and resources would run dry. Contrary to these expectations, however, European economies had indeed held up in the face of intense warfare, as had the wills of the European people, despite the hecatombs of Verdun, the Somme, and many others. If European populations continued to demand not a compromised peace but a complete victory, what hope was there of ending this war? Thus, it is worth us remembering and keeping in mind how earth-shattering 1917 really was, especially as you argue, as I have elsewhere, that the outbreak of the war in 1914 came as a great shock and a great surprise to a European populace that thought that the war scares of 1905 and 1911 already belonged to a distantly fading past. Instead, the shocks and surprises just kept coming. At the start of 1917, Imperial Russia was still a state, if a sometimes weak-looking one. The United States was anti-German but still neutral. Most of the Middle East was under the control of the Ottoman Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, though wounded, was managing to hang on. By the end of 1917, however, the centuries-old Romanov dynasty had given way first to the fragile liberal democracy of Alexander Kerensky, then to the, depending on one's point of view, either inspiring or terrifying Bolshevik revolution at the end of the year. The United States had finally decided to mobilize its tremendous industrial, financial, and eventually military potential on behalf of the Allies, setting in motion a train that has not yet returned to its station. In the Middle East, Jerusalem was, by the end of 1917, in British hands, something hard to envision at the start of that year and impossible even to conceive in 1914. Finally, Central Europe had, by December 1917, at long last begun to envision a future without the Habsburgs, who, however much some of their subjects may have despised them, had provided the glue for a disparate and fractious part of Europe. In other words, we cannot underestimate the seismic changes of the year 1917, nor can we ignore the impacts they had on people living through them. Still, as I said, you know most of this history. So let me here in the remaining time available to note 4 other major shifts that happened in 1917, and I'd ask you to place these military shifts within the tectonic political and cultural shifts that I have just mentioned. Putting all this change together should, I hope, give us a sense of just how transformational 1917 was. Now, this change was neither linear nor universal, and I am deliberately here painting with an incredibly broad brush in front of a room of very talented specialists. That's the tightrope. So first, 1917 ended the myth that the wills and capabilities of the European peoples were unbreakable. In 1916, Europeans had tolerated, even accepted, the monumental casualties of unprecedented battles of attrition like the Somme and Verdun, on top of the deaths of 1914 and 1915, without much cause for consternation among the ruling elite. The exception that proves the rule is that what major disturbances there were came from the peripheries of the European empires and small groups of disaffected rebels, most notably in Dublin and in the Arabian Peninsula. The Irish Republican Brotherhoods rising in Dublin and the Hashemite revolt in the Arabian Desert would later have enormous implications. But at the time, they seemed neither to be harbingers of the future nor any cause for concern in the heart of a Europe that peoples in Berlin, St. Petersburg, or Prague were ready to follow their examples. But 1917 was to be quite different and infinitely more frightening to the ruling elite. Soldier morale in 1917 showed clear signs of finally coming apart. We think most obviously of the failure of Russian soldiers to continue their support of Kerensky's provisional government and the well-known mutinies, or as the French called them, acts of collective indiscipline, on the Chemin des Dames in April. But even in the British Army, often thought of by historians as an exception to this pattern, some new research is showing clear cracks in British morale following the disaster at Third Ypres. Civilian morale too showed cracks, in Russia especially, but not only. It does not appear any longer sustainable to connect the strikes in France in April with the soldier mutinies on the Chemin des Dames, but the correlation of the two events frightened French officials who had every reason to worry about a soldier-worker alliance against an ineffective wartime government. The French had seen that before in the absolute terror of the Paris Commune, 1871. A need to avoid a repeat of that disaster played a major role in bringing Georges Clemenceau to the Prime Minister's office with enormous new wartime powers in November of 1917. In Germany, the so-called turnip winter of 1916-1917, as Holger has argued, led to a doubling of crime and a spike in labor unrest, most famously in Dusseldorf that summer. In the German army, we think of 1918 as the start of major problems of indiscipline, but 1917 too showed cracks in this once vaunted force. The 1917 sections of Hans Herbert Grimm's largely autobiographical novel of the war, Schlump, is full of deserters making up their own worlds, turning abandoned churches into bars and railway stations into refuges for soldiers who had deserted their units and returned to refuse to the front. The soldiers often do so at their anger over the stupidity of the war, but most commonly they do so in an attempt to care for their starving relatives at home. The eponymous character of the novel watches his own father starve to death because there is too little food on the home front, and he also watches as soldiers try to sustain themselves on soup that is too watery and slices of bread so thin that soldiers can see the moonlight shine through them. Even potatoes, a food many German peasants had once considered only fit for livestock, had become rare delicacies. One soldier tells Schlump that his 2 small children and his wife have nothing to eat at all. His 2 older children have had to stop their schooling to scrounge and beg on the streets. His oldest child lights cigarettes with 1 mark notes because the money is useless for buying food that is no longer available for purchase at any price. Morality too has collapsed, as young men sleep with war widows and girls once of good character go off with traders who promise them a few scraps of silk. And it might be worth noting that the traders tempt the women with cloth, not with food, which they can't even get. The book is full of illegitimate pregnancies, alcoholism, and suicides in a Germany that still believed it was winning the war. Still, as one railway worker said in the book, if the war did not end soon, the workers would, quote, have to bring it to a close ourselves, end of quote, regardless of the consequences for the German state. Throughout Europe, concerns about how much longer soldiers, sailors, and civilians would accept a war seemingly without end began to change strategic calculations. I noted Clemenceau's ascendance a few minutes ago. We might also note that Germany's desire to focus on the Eastern Front in 1917, in part to take from Ukraine sufficient food for 1918, drove German strategy. Second, with hindsight, it's possible to see that 1917 reveals a shift in the strategic center of gravity in this global war. The traditional powers of Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy, even Russia became constrained from a number of directions. From above, their movements became increasingly constrained by the United States, whose strategic goals did not overlap with those of Britain and France, as Wilson's 14 points quite starkly revealed. His calls for national self-determination, freedom of the seas, and a League of Nations meant that even if they won the war, Britain and France might not be able to operate as independently as they had in 1914. Wilson may have seen that as a positive change, but Georges Clemenceau and David Lloyd George most surely did not. As Clemenceau said when he first saw the 14 points, God himself was content to give us just 10. From the side, Britain especially became constrained by the desires of its dominions, most importantly Canada, of course, to exercise a co-equal voice in the war and in global strategy. Here it seems to me we can return to what Vimy means as a symbol of this transition. At least according to the Vimy myth, it was on the heights of Vimy that Canada became a nation and an equal player in the strategic voice of the war. At least Canadians' strategic direction of the war. Now, I'm aware that there are many people in this room much more knowledgeable on this subject, and we've heard from them, so I'll leave Canada aside for the moment. But it's also in 1917 that Great Britain's former foe, the South African Jan Smuts, joined the Imperial War Cabinet and the War Policy Committee, influencing both of those bodies to think about the war beyond France and Flanders, to think about Palestine, to think about other fronts. Third, 1917 shows a shift in emphasis at the senior levels of command, I think, from operations to strategy. In the French army, this transition is exemplified in the removal of Robert Nivelle, the ill-fated architect of the disastrous Chemin des Dames offensive of which Vimy is a part. Nivelle had begun from the assumption that the key to victory lay in modernizing the French army's operational methods of war. By better integrating artillery, armor, and just pushing harder, the French would break the German army on the Aisne River and restore mobility to the battlefield. I can find little evidence, however, that Nivelle had thought much about what was to come next. Political and strategic victory would somehow magically follow from operational victory. I am thus left to ask, of Nivelle, of Haig at Passchendaele, or Currie at Vimy for that matter, the same question I ask my students to contemplate when we take them to Gettysburg. Assume for just a moment that Pickett's charge had worked and that the Confederates had broken the Union line on July 3rd, 1863. What then? Would that operational victory really have led to a Confederate strategic victory? Would it have really produced the outcome that William Faulkner so vividly imagined in Intruder in the Dust in 1948? Nivelle's replacement, Ferdinand Foch, saw matters quite differently. Notably, we don't really have names for the battles that Foch fought. We call Haig's campaign the Battle of the 100 Days, but Foch's have no easy descriptor, and not only because my attempt to introduce the phrase 118 days to victory is a less elegant phrase. I've spent a lot of time in Foch's papers, and I think I can say with some degree of confidence that he would not be too much bothered that his battles are not remembered by a big name. For Foch understood that winning battles mattered little by 1917 and 1918. The Germans had won battle after battle without materially affecting their chances for permanent victory, even during the spring offensives of 1918. Foch was nearly alone in seeing this change at the strategic level of war. Henri-Philippe Pétain, his fellow general and sometimes rival, never did make this transition, nor would I argue did Haig or Pershing. Foch was among the very few generals who had internalized the Clausewitzian maxim that war is an extension of politics by other means. Victory, therefore, comes from setting political objectives and then tailoring military objectives to them. Taking a ridge or temporarily breaking a line or attriting the enemy would not achieve those ends without an effective linkage to the political end. Now, I suspect that Foch's time as commandant of the French Army War College gave him a deep appreciation of Clausewitz, And I also suspect that this appreciation helped him adapt his thinking about war from 1914 to 1917. In October 1918, Foix wrote to Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau with the request that the French government dispatch to his headquarters a liaison officer from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Foix wanted to be informed, he told Clemenceau, about your views and the views of the Allied government regarding the terms of the armistice. That Allied politicians read his request as a threat to their own authority over political matters speaks volumes about their lack of depth at the strategic level and Foch's laser focus on that same strategic level, though it did have drawbacks. Fourth and finally, 1917 marks the end of confidence in technology as a war winner on its own. Throughout 1916, war planners had put their faith in a number of potential technological advances, including the Eindecker single-wing fighter plane, the tank, and the flamethrower, among others. To be sure, all of these technologies had potential, and all of them terrified their opponents. But the advantage they provided normally proved to be ephemeral. By 1917, neither side any longer claimed any permanent technological advantage over the other. Although Pétain famously said that after he quelled the Chemin des Dames mutinies, that France would wait for the tanks and the Americans, even he knew that the tanks by themselves would not be a war winner. This is, of course, not to argue that technology was irrelevant, merely that by 1917, faith in its ability as a war winner had waned. Here we can look to the German stormtroop tactics of 1918 as an example. These methods relied on technology, to be sure, but they were at base less in innovation and technology than in command and control. The key lay not in bringing some new secret technological solution to the battlefield, but in devolving decision-making to the lowest levels of command, the Auftrag tactique that Christian mentioned yesterday. Soldiers, not weapons, would win the war. America's failed open warfare methods, similarly, did not depend on any new technological innovations. Instead, John Pershing's doughboys would win using their rifles and bayonets. Arguably, the most famous American engagement of the war, that at Belleau Wood, is celebrated at least in part because the Americans allegedly won it by their sheer will and courage, fighting in a place so geographically constrained that it neutralized technological advantages in favor of rifles and bayonets. Now, for better or worse, Foch saw these changes in 1917 and devised a strategy to maximize them. He correctly deduced that the key to winning the war lay not in winning battles, but in convincing the Germans that they had to come to a political solution, or at least to an armistice, that neutralized their ability to continue to make war. He knew that doing so would not be spectacular, and it would not come after one battle a la Jena, Königgrätz, or Waterloo. Unlike Ludendorff, he was not content merely to punch a hole. He wanted to win a war. Now let me wrap up by noting Foch's approach carried with it a number of assumptions. First, he assumed that victory need not be total. The key lay in breaking German will before the Germans could break Allied will. Again, that Clausewitzian interaction of opposites. The events of 1917 had shown him that Allied will was no longer an inexhaustible resource. Second, Foch's focus was on Germany, meaning that imperial issues and even Eastern European issues sank to second or third place in his calculations. And finally, Foch recognized that the politicians, not the soldiers, would have the ultimate responsibility for setting the peace. His job was to set the preconditions in an armistice for them to negotiate a permanent treaty to assure lasting peace. That they failed to do so is a topic for another conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. We've got lots of time, by the standards of this conference for sure, for questions. We can go for 25 minutes. So if people would, again, just go to either microphone and I'll identify them. What we don't have right now is working microphones, apparently, at the front. So. Yes.
I'm it for the moment. I'm Sheldon Fulton. I just happen to be a very interested amateur historian, but and an avid reader of both Dr. Cook and Dr. Granatstein's books. But I have a question, and I'll try to put it to the entire panel. Let me do a bit of a preamble on it. And it's about Vimy, and it's about the quest for what is Vimy and what does it mean, and just some comments. It's about people and soldiers and officers and politicians and civilians, and it's about families. It's an identity. It's about a town in France or in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's about a ridge, it's about a hill, it's about a battle, it's about tunnels, it's about trenches. It's also about a memorial, as you say, Dr. Cook, in your book, commemoration, a sculpture. But my perspective, I guess, is that it is something that is quintessentially Canadian. And my question is going to be, what if it wasn't Canada that took the hill? What if it was some other country? And let me make some observations on that. So, quintessentially Canadian, it's not the most important battle of the war. It's not even a turning point in the war. It is a most grandiose sculpture, and it's a great memorial, but we don't even recognize the individual that did it. I think, as you say in your book, Dr. Cook, his name was only mentioned once in 1936. It was led by the British, as you say, Dr. Granatstein, and it's our greatest memorial from that is a hockey trophy, Lady Bing's recognition for gentleman, the most gentlemanly hockey player, which is kind of an interesting perspective. As Dr. Derfinger said, Vimy is a thorn in 50 years later that's used by both sides. It's used by both the French Canadians and the English Canadians. Tim, as you mentioned, we have dancing and singing. We're not sure how to celebrate Vimy, which makes it quintessentially Canadian as well. So it's difficult to be proud in public if you're Canadian. And I'm going to finally address it to Dr. Neiberg as well. If this had been a U.S. victory, how would Vimy be recognized in the U.S.? So first off, the two doctors, I think it's quintessentially Canadian. I think it's like a loonie. I think it's like a toonie. I think it's like the rest of Canada celebrating 50 years of the Toronto Maple Leafs losing, as I see a jacket over there. So, your comments, please.
Mics are not working. I just made that point. We're micless.
Quintessentially Canadian.
This is working.
This one's working?
Yeah, that one's working. You can take that.
Quintessentially Canadian in the sense that even after 100 years and even after a big ceremony in the last month, most Canadians still don't know what it is. They don't know what Vimy was. They don't know what war it was in. They don't know who we were fighting or who our allies were. It gets a little better when we have a ceremony. It maybe gets it up to maybe towards 50% of the public. But in terms of understanding or reading the papers or watching it on TV, I don't think Canadians know much about Vimy. And that is the quintessential Canadian thing. We just don't.
So this may be sacrilegious to say, but I think when we study national history, we tend to think a lot of things are distinct and unique to our own society, which are, of course, shared by a lot of societies. The United States does have enormous monuments on the Western Front. I think the single largest one is the American one at Varennes. There's also one almost the same size as Chateau Thierry. And as Jack said, these are enormous monuments that were once very important, that nobody in the United States knows they exist. Nobody knows what they're for. Nobody knows what the war is for. So in that sense, the United States did build memorials very similar to Vimy. They become places of pilgrimage in important moments, and then they're forgotten. The one at Varennes is quite literally in danger of falling off of this hillside if something isn't done to fix it. And there is nobody in the United States, no element of the U.S. government, that has been willing even to contemplate a bill to simply fix a hillside so this thing doesn't fall off the hill. So I think the French have finally agreed that they will do it. But I'm always a little skeptical of these things that we think of as quintessentially nationalist, unless we take a really good look at them.
I think to just grab one thing that you said, if we hadn't built the monument at Vimy Ridge, we wouldn't be talking about Vimy Ridge today in the same way that we do. That's quite clear to me. I would also, though, say that I maybe am a little more optimistic than Jack. I do think Canadians know about Vimy. I think it matters to many Canadians. I think one thing we have to acknowledge is it doesn't mean the same thing to the same people over time. And I think that there is a process here of which we recognize Vimy or we don't. And it doesn't mean the birth of the nation to many Canadians. And there are others who can't identify it and have no idea why we have the Twin Towers on our $20 bill, and that's a part of it. But I think maybe that's asking too much of a historical event. Maybe it is enough to say that Vimy matters to many of us, that we are a big and a complex nation, that we have multiple symbols that represent who we are to ourselves, but we don't have that many that we can agree upon. We tend to be seen as an agreeable people, but we sure do fight over our history and our culture, to the point where this year, in a couple of months when we mark the 150th, we seem to be quite afraid to say anything about our history. We seem to be afraid to engage with the past. We seem to only be able to view it through a prism of oppression. And I think as a mature country, as one that has a rich history, and one without sounding like a propagandist, I think that many countries turn to for some guidance, we should be able to say that we have a complex country. We've done good and bad things. Those are platitudes there, but surely we can say that. And if there's anything that stands out in the martial realm, it is Vimy. Vimy matters to us for a bunch of reasons, and I think we'll stick with that.
Yes.
This question's for Dr. Granatstein and Dr. Cook, and I should first premise that last year I had to take a course that was based around Ian Mackay's essay on liberalism and hegemony, so that did unfortunately affect my thinking a bit. It's regarding the concept of soldiers being mostly British-born in the Canadian forces, where there's been arguments, both positive and negative, like they were British-born, so it's not really a Canadian army, whereas others have argued, such as myself, that it's more of a moot point in that, yes, they were not British-born. You can find a lot of the cases of that in the Second World War, even in the modern day, where you're not born in Canada, but you come to Canada, you live in Canada, you start to feel Canadian. I'm just interested in your thoughts about this British-born argument in the Canadian forces during the First World War.
I think, by and large, many of the men who volunteered, especially at the beginning, wanted a trip home and wanted to go see Mum. And I think that had a lot to do with it. It was a kind of nostalgic idea. It was also empire. They believed in the crown, the king, the British Empire. And in Canada, of course, those attitudes were very strong as well. But I think the key thing in determining who enlists is how long you've been in Canada. Not 5 years, but how long your family history is in Canada. Francophones had come in the 15th and 16th and 17th century. Their ties to Europe had dwindled dramatically. They had no particular loyalty to France, as we heard yesterday, quite rightly. The Anglo-Canadians who had come in the 1800s and some in the 1700s had been here a long time. Their loyalty had become to Canada. The Francophone argument for not volunteering in large numbers was always, if Canada was threatened, we would rally. But we owe nothing to Europe. And I think a lot of English Canadians felt the same way. The reality is, when you look at the overall numbers, that almost 3/4 of the eligible British-born men in Canada enlist, and it's about 20% of the eligible Canadian-born men. That's a striking difference. And I think the real explanation is simply that the Canadian-born came from people who had been here largely a long time, and their ties to Europe had dwindled. Canada seriously was not threatened. What did it mean to them? Yeah, they were pressed. Yeah, they were forced to go. Yeah, they were eventually conscripted. But was it their war? Not necessarily.
I would respond to that by saying two things. One, I think there is a fluid sense of identity of what it is to be Canadian in 1914, 15, 16, and I think it's something that bears more study from scholars, as what did these men think they were? And I think, as Jack says, almost all of them believed in king and country, but is it more king or is it more country? Or once they get to the trenches, is it less king, less country, and more about the guy beside you? All of these factors come into play, and I do think that the Canadian Corps, which we often talk about in purely military terms, the 4 divisions coming together, our most recognizable symbol of martial strength on the Western Front, it's also a place where Canadians are coming together from across the country, and you see that. You see the guys talking and saying, I met my first French Canadian today. He's a pretty good guy. There's Scottish guys and Irish guys, and 2 Irish guys are fighting about British politics. And there's a Japanese Canadian here, and it goes on and on. The Canadian Corps truly is a representation of the country. It has Canadians, British-born, Canadian-born, French-Canadian, New Canadians, First Nations all together. Now, in different proportions, in different percentages, over different parts in the war. The sources that we base these stats on are very difficult to use. You can read them in different ways. They are flawed, but they are a thing to talk about. And I think this idea of fluid identities is one that we should study more. And to finish that, I would just say, what we go into the war may be one thing. What we come out of the war as, in terms of identity, may be something else. And certainly there are a number of Canadians who serve with the Canadian Corps who say, not the idea of we go up Vimy as provincials or colonials, we come down as nationals, but we are different. We do feel different, and that's a part of the larger war effort.
I'll just add real quick, there's a new 5-volume history of Australia in World War I, edited by Tim's PhD supervisor, and a big theme of that is the fluidity of identity in 1914, that Australians didn't see the distinction between Australian and imperial identities in the way that they do today, that those things. So I think Tim's right. We have to think about fluidity of identity.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Rob?
Thank you. 3 amazing presentations. I've got a question for Tim and for Jack, though. Tim, and you hinted at this in the presentation. I'd love you to sort of expand, and I suspect it's in your book. How do we understand? I mean, you've given such an outstanding examination of the sort of revival, the Vimy mythology. But how do we now explain the fact that this is gaining credence, particularly against the peacekeeping mythology that was so dominant and that so many of us, of course, kind of pull our hair out in terms of understanding Canada? But can you give an explanation, given the circumstances, outside of the anniversary thesis, which I get, but why do we see this starting to resonate amongst Canadians, particularly, as you point out, is such a different Canada? Mm-hmm. And for Jack, if I can ask you, once again, I love the details of your presentations and all the rest, and your thesis where you show fact versus mythology. But what ultimately does that mean, that mythology tends to trump facts in the way that you're able to bring? So as a country, what does that ultimately, where does that lead us, the fact that the facts don't matter nearly as much as the mythology?
This idea that Canadians are a peaceable kingdom, that the peacekeeper is one of our key symbols, is one that is a dominant one, obviously, in the second half of the 20th century. It's often how we defined ourselves in relation to the United States. It doesn't stand up, of course, if you look at the first half of the 20th century, where we fought 4 wars and were deeply shaped by warfare. But I think this is in the realm of symbols and identities, and I do talk about it in the book, specifically the idea of the peacekeeper. There has been a turn. We know that. If you listen to Ian Mackay, it is because of a Harper government militaristic plot supported by Jack Granatstein and David Berkison. And now Tim Cook. Yeah. Without a doubt, we re-embrace the idea of military history and our veterans. I think it goes back at least 10 years before that, and it goes back to the 1990s. And here I think we do need new and a powerful look at what happened in the 1990s. And I'll just name a few things to you, right? The Valor and the Horror, 1992, the 3-part NFB series that so deeply angered and offended veterans of the Second World War, where they began to galvanize and push back. Volume 3 of the Official History, to a lesser extent, doing echoing some of those messages. But then the turn in 1994 and 95, of which Jack was a key player with CBC, this return of veterans to the continent. Canadians, I think, woke up to this idea that we had a generation of veterans who we had not paid much attention to over time, and that we should do something. And the other key event in 1995, I think, is the existential crisis that Canada went through with the Quebec referendum, where we nearly lost our country. And I think it is from those dates, along with the fact that our Second World War veterans began to die off in greater numbers, and that their children and their grandchildren began to return to those local cenotaphs on Remembrance Day and to reflect upon what their dads or granddads or grandmothers had done. And I think all of it comes together. Now, none of that speaks to Vimy, does it? But Vimy comes out of that. And of course, you can't deny that we fought for 10 years in Afghanistan. And Vimy, as I talk about in the book, is also wrapped up in that. So it's a complex idea, but it's one that we should think about how we mark our military history that goes beyond just the return to veterans and the idea of thanking them. I think it's a more complex one, and I think we are going through a period, and have gone through it for at least 10 years, probably closer to 20, of reinvigorating and seeing ourselves as a different type of people.
Myths matter. History doesn't. 20 years ago, I did a little book called Who Killed Canadian History? And I think it's dead. It's still dead. It's killed by a lack of interest in the public. It's killed by a lack of interest from provincial governments in teaching. It's killed by a lack of interest in the federal government. We're having a sesquicentennial where the themes are reconciliation, environment, and what's the third one, Tim? There's another third one that's totally irrelevant as well. What you don't find is history. There is no history in the sesquicentennial. It's as if somehow we existed for 150 years, and Vimy aside, which they had to mark, there's no history involved. Our history is, as Tim suggested a couple of minutes ago, is mainly shameful. It's best to forget it. Let's look forward only. That allows myths to survive. That allows myths to strengthen. Facts don't matter. And God knows what is taught in history departments all across Canada in the universities. Sure as hell isn't history. It's mainly mythological dreaming of an imagined past. We're drifting along a sea of myth. No.
Yes. You're next, though. We're alternating here.
Sean Brady, a visiting fellow from Trinity College Dublin. Just a question about, we've talked about the positive memory or myths of Vimy Ridge and how it integrates with Canadian national identity and national nation building. The question I'd have is, to what extent were there negative ideas of Vimy as a kind of futile adventure that led to 10,000 dead, and how did that inform Canadian ideas of the war, at least in 1718, or at least maybe in 1919?
I think, as Professor Otherdale has said, it's the immediate messaging coming out of Vimy is one of a significant victory, the driving the Germans back, the capture of the Germans. It's one of victory. What's interesting is to look for those casualty lists and when they begin to show up in the papers, about day 4, 5, 6, 7, and there are thousands of them, and that does shake Canadians, but it doesn't shake the idea of Vimy as a victory. But as my friend Dr. Serge Derflinger is always reminding me, you can't look at Vimy without looking at conscription. And of course, the casualties that come out of Vimy lead directly to the conscription crisis, which is the single most divisive event in modern Canadian history. And you have to understand both of them. And I think, as Pat reminded us yesterday, the war is about coming together like never before and being torn apart like never before, and I think Ireland probably has some resonance there as well, as does really every country. It's why we are still talking about this event 100 years later, that Mike writes about so well, the after effects, the enduring effects, and they certainly are in Canada as well. And I think if there's one point I'd like to make, it is, of course, that Vimy doesn't speak to everybody. That Vimy is not a symbol that is accepted by all, and it means something very different in French Canada. It is really not talked about in the same way there in any degree, and in fact, the First World War in French Canada, for the most part, is viewed through the lens of conscription and oppression and the trampling of rights. And that view was also one held by farmers after the war, and Jack and I are going to do an exhibition together at the War Museum on the 100 Days campaign, and we're going to do a conference on 1919. It's a very dark year for Canada, and we see that with farmers, and we see that with organized labor. So the First World War changes us forever, but also those scars are still with us today.
Rob Rotherdale mentioned Pierre Berton's book, Vimy, which did have a huge impact, I think, when it came out. But what we forget is that Burton ended that book by saying, was it worth it? And his answer was, oh no. In other words, looking back 60 years as he was, or 70 years, the casualties were far more important to him in the end, the bravery and everything else notwithstanding, than the loss of life and the hurt and pain. And it's hard to disagree with that. All I would say in defense of the Vimy battle is that compared to most World War I battles, it was relatively light in its impact on the troops fighting it. I mean, first day of the Somme, 60,000. Vimy, 10,000. Relatively light.
Okay, thank you.
I'm the bearer of both good news and bad news. The bad news is only about 3 minutes left for questions, okay, just so people know they're lining up. And the good news is that right after that, the food is served, so, Barry.
Thanks. I'd like to start, just mention something Northrop Frye said about history tells what happens, myth tells what happens all the time. And something that Michael said, what would a Clausewitzian interpretation of Vimy look like? In other words, what is the political purpose that was served by it? And I don't think it was birth of a nation. Certainly not so far as the French-speaking part of Laurentian Canada is concerned in 1917. Not so far as the mainly agricultural West was concerned a decade or two later. But I would suggest that the Vimy myth does reinforce the loyalist myth of English-speaking Laurentian Canada, mostly southern and southwestern Ontario and parts of the Maritimes. It's not about national unity. It's certainly not about national identity, which is a kind of neurotic obsession of loyalist Laurentian Canada. But that myth can very easily appropriate the Vimy myth. But I would say that's all. I think that's also part of our very fluid and mostly regional identities and competing mythologies. And I must say I'm looking forward to seeing what you two guys do about how this gets interpreted by farmers.
I guess the only thing I would add to that is that one of the things about military history that has me so interested in the histories of wars are the unintended consequences that they produce, and the ways that events simply take over, which is, again, a Clausewitzian principle, that you don't control the event the way you think you do. And certainly, I don't think, my colleagues can correct me if I'm wrong, that the CEF had any intention of forging a nation at Vimy. They're part of a wider inter-allied